The first words I heard that night were my sister's, sharp enough to cut through the laughter around us. "Don't get involved. It'll only hurt you." She whispered it low, but the warning landed like a gavel. I caught the sideways glances, the polite smiles that were anything but. I stood there, a glass in my hand, pretending I hadn't heard, pretending the heat rising in my chest was just from the crowded room. They didn't want me there, that much was clear. The conversation shifted every time I drew near, jokes were told with punchlines that excluded me, and the chair at the edge of the table was left open as if I should be grateful for a place on the fringe. Public shame is a subtle thing. It doesn't shout, it hums. That night it hummed like a fluorescent bulb about to burn out. I could have walked away. My sister's hand on my arm told me she hoped I would. She was older, steadier, always better at letting things slide. But I have never been wired that way. Dignity to me meant standing where someone tried to push you out. I smiled, nodded, endured the small slights with a kind of stillness that I know unsettled them. What they didn't see was the resolve hardening underneath. A neighbor leaned across the table, voice loud enough for everyone to hear, asking if I really thought I could fit in here. Laughter followed. I raised my glass, met his eyes, and answered evenly, "I don't fit in anywhere by asking permission." It silenced the room just long enough for me to see their surprise, then the chatter resumed, louder than before. That was my first quiet victory, one line against a tide of ridicule. When the gathering ended, I walked out beneath the street lamps with my sister. She pressed again, "You don't know what you're up against. They've built walls you can't climb." I didn't argue. I let her think I'd heard her. In truth, I had already made up my mind. The walls she saw were not barriers. To me, they were invitations. The contrast was sharp. The humiliation of being dismissed against the calm certainty that I would not leave quietly. They believed I would vanish. What I carried instead was the seed of something far larger. I didn't just intend to stay, I intended to own the ground they stood on. That was the moment my course was set. Their laughter echoed in my ears, but so did the sound of my own voice answering back, steady and measured. They thought it was just bravado. It was. It was the first sign that I was ready to claim a stake none of them imagined I could. Please like and subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. What they saw as shame, I knew as resolve. And soon that quiet resolve would take a form they couldn't ignore. I didn't come to that neighborhood on a whim. By the time I set foot there, I had already traded more nights of sleep than I can count for the kind of stability most people take for granted. Long shifts, double shifts, years of work that left my hands calloused and my patience thin. Every choice I made was angled toward one thing, to finally stand on solid ground. That neighborhood wasn't just a cluster of houses and fences. It was proof to myself that all the years of sacrifice meant something tangible. My sister knew the weight of those years too, but she carried hers differently. She believed in compromise, in keeping your head down, in letting things slide for the sake of peace. I never faulted her for it. She had her own scars from fighting battles that went nowhere, but I carried a different code. Fairness wasn't an abstract word for me. It was the measure of whether I could look at myself in the mirror at the end of a day. I remember the first apartment I rented, thin walls and leaky pipes, and how I promised myself I'd never let my family live under someone else's neglect again. That promise burned hotter than pride. It became the backbone of my decisions. Every dollar I saved was a quiet rebellion against the idea that we had to accept less than we deserved. So when I walked into that community, I wasn't chasing prestige. I was chasing permanence. To me, fairness meant that if you worked, if you contributed, if you stood your ground, you had earned the right to belong. Their cold smiles and dismissive laughter were more than insults. They were a denial of everything I had built my life around. My sister tried to shield me from that sting by reminding me of the practical path. It's not worth it. Keep your head down, stay out of their way. She wasn't wrong from her angle, but to me, staying quiet in the face of exclusion wasn't peace, it was surrender. She saw survival. I saw erosion of dignity. That difference between us defined every conversation we had in those weeks. I wasn't reckless. I never confused stubbornness with chaos. My approach was slow, deliberate, always rooted in lawful ground. I had learned early that shouting doesn't move mountains, but paperwork, patience, and persistence can. And beneath the humiliation of that night, I felt something unshakable, the certainty that my place there wasn't conditional on their approval. There's a kind of contrast you only see clearly when someone dismisses you. In their eyes, my presence was disposable. In mine, their dismissal only underscored how much my presence mattered. They could laugh, they could whisper, they could exclude, but they could not erase the years that brought me there. And it wasn't just about me. I thought about the kids riding their bikes on cracked sidewalks, the families paying dues without knowing where the money went, the elderly neighbor whose concerns were brushed aside at every meeting. I saw the way silence had become the currency of that place. Speak up, and you'd be pushed out. That kind of culture corrodes a community from the inside. I couldn't ignore it, not because I wanted a fight, but because I had already fought too hard in life to hand over my hard-earned peace to people who mistook arrogance for authority. Every part of me knew this mattered more than my pride. It was about proving that dignity had a place there. By the way, let me know where you're listening from tonight. I always wonder where these stories land. So when my sister urged me to stay away, I understood her fear. But I also understood myself. My sacrifices had not been made to settle for a corner seat and polite dismissal. They had been made so that when I finally stood in a place I could call mine, I would stand fully without bowing my head. And that is why her warning, however loving, could never be the last word. The moment they treated me as if I didn't matter, they confirmed exactly why I did, and why I would not back down. What they thought was dismissal was, in truth, the very fuel I needed to begin. It happened on a Saturday morning, the kind where the sun feels like it's promising you a fresh start. I had gone to the community hall for what was supposed to be a routine meeting. The agenda looked harmless: budgets, maintenance schedules, event planning, but I knew better than to trust the paper. The real decisions never sat in ink. They lived in the tone of the people holding the pens. Halfway through, the chair of the association cleared his throat and announced, "Certain residents will not be allowed to vote on financial matters this year." He didn't glance my way, but every eye in the room turned toward me. A silence followed, polite but sharp. My name wasn't spoken, but it didn't need to be. The exclusion was targeted, deliberate, wrapped in procedural language meant to sound legitimate. I raised my hand. "Excuse me," I said evenly, "on what grounds?" The chair shifted in his seat. "It's in the bylaws," he answered too quickly. I knew the bylaws. I had read every page, underlined passages, dog-eared corners. There was no clause for this. "I must have missed that section," I replied. "Perhaps you can point me to the exact language." His jaw tightened. "This isn't the place for debate," he said. My sister, seated near the back, gave me a look that begged me to let it go. But the line had been crossed. It wasn't just exclusion, it was exploitation of authority in plain view. Civility demanded I ask. Contempt demanded he refuse. After the meeting broke, I caught him near the doorway. The crowd had thinned, but my voice was steady enough to carry. "You know that what you announced isn't lawful," I said. He smirked, lowering his voice. "People here prefer harmony. Don't make waves. You'll only find yourself on the outside looking in." "Then maybe the view from the outside isn't as lonely as you think," I replied. He leaned closer, as if confiding. "You don't belong here. No one will stand with you." For a moment, we simply looked at each other. His contempt was naked, unashamed, as if he were daring me to challenge him. I didn't raise my voice, didn't break stride. "We'll see," I said, and walked past him into the daylight. That was the fracture point, the moment civility cracked and revealed the contempt underneath. They weren't just trying to keep me quiet, they were counting on my silence to keep their control intact. I went home that afternoon not with anger, but with clarity. Every insult up to then had been personal. This one was structural, and structural abuses don't fade with time. They calcify until someone challenges them. I set the meeting notes on my desk, opened the bylaws again, and started marking the places where their authority ended and accountability began. The process would be slow, deliberate, unglamorous, but that was exactly why I trusted it. They believed I had no place. I knew I had the patience to prove otherwise, and that was the first step in a methodical counter they would never see coming. At first glance, the neighborhood looked picture perfect. Lawns trimmed, driveways washed, holiday banners hung neatly in season. To a casual eye, it was harmony, but once you knew where to look, you could see the seams. A broken light fixture that stayed unfixed for months despite collected dues. A playground renovation fund that kept being delayed without explanation. Whispers at the mailbox about fees increasing, but no receipts to show for it. I started listening more closely. The same people who laughed loudest at meetings fell quiet when asked direct questions. Neighbors who once brushed me off began dropping small hints, their voices careful, almost guilty. "Funny how the budget never balances," one muttered. Another shook her head saying, "Don't ask too many questions, they don't like that." It wasn't just neglect, it was a pattern, surface harmony covered hidden rot. One evening, I stopped by City Hall under the pretense of filing a routine permit. While I was there, I asked about the association's public filings, documents most residents never thought to request. The clerk slid a stack of papers across the counter with a neutral expression. Inside those pages lay numbers that didn't add up, signatures that looked suspiciously familiar, and expenses routed in directions that had little to do with community care. That night, I spread the papers across my kitchen table. Line by line, I traced the flow of money, the justifications that contradicted the bylaws, the quiet siphoning hidden beneath official language. It was worse than whispers. It was a quiet betrayal masked as order. I wasn't the only one who noticed. An unlikely ally appeared in the form of a neighbor I barely knew, a retired accountant who had been dismissed one too many times when he raised concerns. He knocked on my door one evening, holding a folder and a weary smile. "I heard you've been asking questions," he said. "I've been reading what they'd rather we didn't," I answered. He opened his folder to reveal spreadsheets, annotated and cross-checked. "Then you'll want to see this." Together we compared notes, his meticulous breakdowns with my stack of filings. What emerged was undeniable: funds diverted, obligations ignored, and a leadership more concerned with appearances than accountability. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Outwardly, the neighborhood gleamed. Beneath, it was eroding from the inside out. I closed the folder that night with a calm I hadn't felt since the first insult. I wasn't imagining things. The cracks were real, widening, and now I wasn't alone in seeing them. And once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. They demand a response. The first move had to be clean. No shouting, no spectacle, just one undeniable step that couldn't be brushed aside as bitterness. After weeks of reading and cross-checking, I filed a formal complaint with the city's Housing Oversight Board. It was a simple packet of documents, receipts against bylaws, unexplained withdrawals lined up against promises never kept. I didn't attach opinion, only fact. When I slid the envelope across the counter, the clerk barely looked up. To him, it was just another file in a stack. But to me, it was the first stone turned in ground they thought would never shift. A few days later, I made a second move, quieter but sharper. One of the smaller homes on the edge of the neighborhood had been sitting on the market for months. Most ignored it. The paint was chipped, the yard overgrown. I bought it outright. No fanfare, no announcement, just a set of keys in my pocket and a deed in my name. The combination was deliberate. On one hand, I was challenging the leadership through the channels they claimed to respect. On the other, I was planting myself deeper into the very soil they hoped I'd leave. The ripples came faster than I expected. At the next community meeting, the chair read the agenda with his usual authority, but his hands shook slightly when he reached the financial updates. Someone in the back whispered, "Did you hear about the complaint?" Another added, "And now he owns a house here too." The murmurs spread, not loud enough to break decorum, but steady enough to unsettle. I sat quietly, offering no confirmation. Their discomfort was proof enough. A single house, a single complaint, small acts, but they carried the weight of intent. Afterward, a neighbor approached me in the parking lot. "I don't know what you're planning," she said, voice low, "but thank you for saying what the rest of us can't." I told her the truth. I'm not planning noise, I'm planning order. That was the heart of it. They had thrived on chaos disguised as control, and the moment someone introduced clarity, their grip loosened. The contrast struck me even then, how little I had done and how much it shook them. They had built their authority on the assumption that no one would ever challenge it. One clean act of accountability, one purchase of permanence, and already the ground was shifting beneath them. I didn't smile, didn't gloat. Quiet strength isn't about celebration. It's about standing steady as the first cracks widen into something undeniable. And these were only the first stones. Others would turn soon enough. After the first moves, I settled into a rhythm of deliberate escalation. Each action measured, lawful, and slow enough to leave no question of intent. I acquired 2 more properties over the following months, small holdings, but strategic edges of the neighborhood where influence was weakest. Each deed, each official filing was a legal assertion. I belonged here, and I was not leaving. At the same time, I began challenging the board on procedural grounds. I requested full financial disclosures, pointing out missing receipts, inconsistencies in maintenance reports, and unauthorized allocations. Every request followed the proper channels, every citation referenced the bylaws. No theatrics, no threats, just persistent attention to detail. I discovered contracts that allowed the leadership to sidestep accountability, and I made it a point to flag them with the oversight committee. The nights grew long. I pored over spreadsheets, scanned pages for signatures, cross-referenced dates and amounts. My hands ached from the constant writing, my eyes strung from reading lines I knew would be disputed. Even my sister noticed the toll. "You're wearing yourself thin," she said. I only nodded. It wasn't reckless obsession, it was the weight of responsibility. Every small error they had hidden needed exposure, and someone had to do it. The neighborhood chatter started to shift. Quiet murmurs became cautious questions. "Have you seen the new filings?" one resident asked another. "Seems like someone's paying attention," replied a woman I barely knew, glancing at me across the park. Each time a neighbor expressed awareness, the unseen momentum grew. They hadn't anticipated public accountability paired with silent, lawful persistence. Then the unexpected happened. At a weekend gathering, a group of homeowners approached me together. "We've been talking," one said. "We can't ignore what you've uncovered. We'll back you at the next meeting." I felt the air shift in that room. People who had once avoided my gaze now stood with subtle but unmistakable support. A quiet, public show that disrupted the assumed order. Yet the private cost was real. Papers stacked on my kitchen table like miniature barricades, phone calls that lasted into the early hours, and the gnawing tension of every interaction. The balance between exposure and legality demanded attention, patience, and nerve. Every error I found required methodical documentation. Every property acquisition needed careful timing. It was exhausting, but the credibility I built outweighed the fatigue. The contrast between effort and effect became sharper with each passing week. Alone at my desk, I bore the stress and scrutiny. In the meeting rooms and on the streets, that labor translated into momentum that could not be denied. They felt the pressure mounting before they could even locate its source. And in that rising tide of awareness and quiet support, I realized the pattern was clear. One methodical move after another, executed lawfully, could shift the balance of power. My private diligence was now rippling outward, shaking the community's assumptions. The walls of complacency had begun to crack. And soon, those cracks would become impossible to ignore. The day came sooner than I expected. I walked into the community hall, dossier in hand, knowing that the confrontation could not be avoided. The room was the same as before, polished floors, chairs arranged neatly, a veneer of civility. But I carried with me months of research, records, and documented evidence, silent authority that spoke louder than any raised voice. He was waiting near the front, the chair of the board, exuding the same confidence that had once made me hesitate. "You again," he said, tone dripping with sarcasm. "I thought you'd grown tired of these games." "No games," I replied evenly, "facts, and I'd like to go through them with you now." I laid out the discrepancies one by one. Funds misallocated, contracts bypassed, maintenance funds unaccounted for, every document neatly tabbed, every date verified. I spoke slowly, deliberately, letting each piece of evidence land before moving to the next. He interrupted at first, voice rising. "That's nothing. You're making mountains out of molehills. We've been running this community fine for years." I didn't respond to the volume. I simply placed another set of pages on the table. "These aren't molehills," I said. "This is the record of what has happened. You may prefer to ignore it, but it exists regardless of opinion." He sputtered, shifting uncomfortably, trying to summon indignation or charm, but the words faltered. The evidence was immovable. I could see him calculating, searching for a way to regain the stage, but every angle was blocked by fact. "You think you can come in here and, what, take over?" he demanded, voice sharp, eyes flicking to the audience of neighbors gathered behind me. "I'm not taking over," I said calmly. "I'm asking for accountability, transparency, fair treatment. The bylaws exist for everyone, including you." There was a pause, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of shifted power. I didn't need to shout or threaten. Quiet strength has a way of filling a room louder than bluster ever could. One by one, the neighbors murmured, acknowledging what they saw. The tide had turned not because of volume, but because the truth had been presented clearly, methodically, without ego or spectacle. The chair's jaw tightened, his confident stance wavered. "Fine," he said finally, almost reluctantly. "We'll review the documents, see what can be done." I nodded, no celebration, no gloating, just the acknowledgement that a line had been drawn. The contrast was unmistakable, his loud, defensive denial crumbling under the weight of calm evidence. And as I walked out of that room, I knew the next phase was already forming, the public reckoning that would follow, now inevitable. By the time the next meeting rolled around, the air in the room was different. The chair who had once ruled with quiet certainty now fidgeted behind the podium, his authority diminished before a room full of neighbors. Every hand that rose in support carried the weight of months of observation, documentation, and lawful insistence on transparency. Decisions that had once passed unquestioned were now debated openly. Board members who had leaned on silence for protection shifted uneasily, recalculating loyalties as the community watched. The ripple effect of my methodical moves became undeniable. Bylaws were enforced, missing funds were reconciled, and audits were scheduled. Authority that had relied on intimidation and obfuscation could no longer operate unchecked. I noticed subtle changes among neighbors. Those who had once dismissed me now offered nods, brief conversations, or a quiet word of acknowledgement. Some even began sharing their own frustrations, validated by the process I had ignited. Public opinion, once apathetic or complicit, now demanded accountability. Even the rival who had opposed me most vocally could no longer maintain a posture of invulnerability. At a small gathering afterward, he approached, a mixture of caution and curiosity in his expression. "I underestimated you," he admitted quietly. "I didn't think someone would see through it all and keep at it." I didn't answer with triumph. I simply nodded. Respect earned under the weight of facts and patience doesn't need applause. The contrast between his crumbling control and my steady justice was evident in every measured step I took, every calm answer to pointed questions. The neighborhood began to operate differently. Meetings were transparent, funds were accounted for, voices previously silenced found space to be heard. Lawful consequences had done their work, leaving no room for retaliation or grievance. The community itself had been reshaped, quietly but irrevocably, by the insistence on fairness over ego. I still bore the cost in private: late nights, meticulous record-keeping, phone calls, and stress, but the impact was undeniable. The narrative had shifted from one of exclusion and contempt to one of accountability and cautious hope. And as I walked the streets, seeing families laughing in yards that were once neglected, I realized something important. Influence isn't measured by fear. It's measured by the change left behind. The ripples I had started were now rolling steadily, and the balance had tipped. Even those who had resisted most fiercely now regarded me with an uneasy respect. Control had crumbled, justice had endured, and for the first time, I could imagine what would come next. The work didn't end when the board stepped aside. I had no interest in lingering grudges or empty victories. Instead, I turned toward what could endure. I established a small community fund, aimed at maintaining the neglected properties and supporting families struggling with rising costs. It wasn't flashy or publicized, but the impact was tangible. A repaired playground, updated street lighting, and scholarships for local children. I began mentoring a few neighbors who had shown interest in civic participation but were intimidated by the bureaucracy. I taught them how to read bylaws, how to track finances, how to ask questions without fear. Quiet empowerment became my measure of success, far more than any titles or ownership stakes. Even in my own home, I drew new boundaries. My sister watched, sometimes skeptical, sometimes proud, as I balanced involvement with personal life. I understood now that influence without restraint is no gift at all. Purpose must be coupled with preservation of one's own dignity. The contrast was unmistakable. Where revenge might have demanded spectacle, humiliation, or public shaming, my actions sought stability, not vengeance. I had satisfied a sense of justice, but my true satisfaction came from fostering resilience, fairness, and hope that would last beyond my tenure in the neighborhood. Walking the streets, I saw the difference, a sense of calm, of shared responsibility replacing fear and secrecy. The same community that had once dismissed me now had space to thrive, and I realized the legacy I wanted wasn't about asserting dominance, it was about sustaining what mattered. Revenge had been a spark, but purpose became the steady flame. The neighborhood would remember fairness more than conflict, and I would remember that enduring change requires patience, clarity, and a refusal to let personal ego dictate the outcome. And with that, I finally understood what it meant to stand fully, not for myself alone, but for the community I had come to call home. I found my sister on the porch one evening, a glass of tea in her hand and a quiet look in her eyes. We didn't speak at first, words weren't necessary. Months of tension, triumph, and lawful maneuvering had passed, leaving a calm space between us. Finally, she said, "You did what I thought impossible." I smiled, nodding. We did what had to be done. There was no gloating, no recounting of victories, just an acknowledgement of effort, respect, and the fact that some battles are best measured in results, not noise. We sat side by side, watching the neighborhood settle into a new rhythm, balanced, accountable, alive in ways it hadn't been before. The contrast was clear. Where chaos and dismissal once ruled, there was now quiet order. Where I had expected pride, I felt peace. Where revenge might have demanded spectacle, I found closure. And now I want to hear from you. Would you forgive and rebuild, or hold your distance? I'd like to hear why. Please like and subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The night air held a soft promise. Somewhere down the street, a new challenge waited, another story of justice, patience, and quiet resolve. And when the time comes, I'll be ready to meet it, not with anger, but with measured purpose.